Hi, folks. Since Lex and I are not going to be able to meet with you before, as a group, as a large group, to go over these things all together before the artist statements are due, I did want to communicate, he and I did want to communicate to you some of these big ideas ahead of time to help you writing your artist statement. All this information is found on Moodle. We could have just directed you to that part, and feel free to reference that. That's probably a smart thing to do. But we typically do this in person, because it's easier just to communicate a lot of this stuff face to face. So I'm just going to go ahead and plow through these things and hit the high points here so that we're all on the same page about that. In terms of writing an artist statement, some of the bigger things that can be helpful is to create a list of ideas or create a whole list of as you're working, typically when I've done this, as I'm working on the artwork itself, what I'll do is I will sort of keep a sketchbook close by. And so, how, phrases pop into your head, ideas pop into your head, just start collecting and amassing all of this stuff. If you sit down to just write an artist statement without doing any kind of prep work, what's going to happen is you're going to create something that's very generic and vague and not very interesting. And so you want to be kind of getting into the habit of sort of amassing all of this stuff, collecting all these stuff, little tidbits that you find like coins on the ground, right? Just pick them up and put them in your pocket so that when you sit down to start writing these things, you actually have a dozen or 2 dozen phrases, words, ideas, vague notions that you can use to start to put that thing together. So that's the first thing, is just get in the habit of sort of collecting it, a little sketchbook, whatever, keep a file on your phone, however you want to do that. Another thing that can be really helpful too is to, once you have started amassing all of this stuff, and you really should be starting with, probably 25 or 30 different ideas like this. Not necessarily diverse ideas, but just different phrases, words, ideas, sentences, maybe even things that you steal, that you find online or borrow, whatever. But a good idea is to get like 25, 30 or more of these, so you have a strong database and you can be talking about things that are really relevant, because you're going to go through that stuff pretty quickly as you start writing. Another thing that can be really helpful once you sort of amass all of this stuff is to start to, sometimes I have done this where I just take a little piece of paper, write things, each of them down on little pieces of paper, and start creating piles of things where you're putting, ideas together, and just see what emerges, see what happens. Often what you will find is that you have 2 or 3 major ideas that you can start to write about. That's great. In any case, you want to be collecting this and starting to organize them and put those into sentences that begin to become coherent and start to work. As a reminder, for this assignment, we are allowing you to use AI for this. And a temptation, I think, is for you to come up with 2 or 3 ideas, pop them into ChatGPT, and you're going to get something back that sounds vaguely art statement-ish. That is not going to be sort of the most helpful thing that you can find, because I think the difference between a good statement and a really not so good statement is specificity. It's easy to make things that is sort of a vague, and that's what ChatGPT does. It sort of approximates. And so it's pretty easy to find artist statements that have been generated this way. And so the challenge for you, the battle for you, frankly, is going to be generating something that is specific to what you are doing and your ideas. And to do that, you're going to have to be like putting really good content in, which means like a lot of content into that. So amass a lot of stuff, amass a lot of things that are really specific to you. Start grouping these things together, and then, maybe start playing around with ChatGPT if you want, or else just like start writing sentences. These statements don't have to be long. We're not talking pages. Typically like just like a really normal looking paragraph. I don't know how many words that is, but a couple hundred words tops. Like most artist statements are brief-ish. It's like a one healthy paragraph and you're done. And so that's all you really need. Having said that, you will find that in writing statements like this, this could be one of the harder bits of writing. The thesis is long. Certainly it takes a lot of investing to get that thing off the ground, but the artist statement is actually trickier to do because you are having to sort of hit certain goals in that thing, talking about your work. So in any case, collect a bunch of stuff, put it together, start generating sentences, and it does not have to be long, it just has to be right, okay? Some other things that can be really helpful about what you are, when you start putting these sentences together and actually crafting these things, is you don't want to be, an artist statement is actually sort of misnamed right from the start. It's not really an artist statement, it's a artwork statement, because we're not really asking you, or the best statements are perhaps not about your ideas about art in general. That's not super helpful for the things that we're looking at here. So you want to write about the actual work, the stuff that you're actually constructing. Like, what is that stuff? And you can super quickly, I think art is about, those kinds of statements are really not going to be helpful. What you want to talk about is the work itself, where it came from, how it functions, maybe some ideas that go into it, things like that. So write about a particular artwork or a series of related artworks, and don't get sort of sidetracked by talking about art in general. That thing is actually both a little easier and a little harder than sort of, writing about art in general. And another thing you could say is you're not trying to explain the work. That's another place, my work is about, if you're starting with that sentence, that's tough, Maybe what you want to do is talk about, my work comes from a place of, or I find inspiration from, or this, my work relates to this other artist. But you're not trying to explain this stuff, which is not really possible anyway, but that's not the goal. What you're trying to do is to create a companion for your work. It's an opportunity to allow people, give people some language so they can start to access it in ways that they did not have access to it before. So it should supplement the work, it should complement, but if you find yourself stuck because you're trying to explain the work, it's like, don't do that. Because you're sort of diffusing the energy of the pieces. Much better to just start, talking about the context for the work, how you make it, what it is, what the materials mean to you, how you think that thing functions for you, and allow the work to sort of stand by itself. The tone of your statement should be expressive of your work. If your work is very funny, feel free to, the statement should be funny. If your work is more conversational about interpersonal relationships, it should maybe start to relate to that. So these don't have to be, or they should not be, overly smart, overly academic. They should be accessible. They should relate. They should use the tone and the language of the work that you are making and kind of match that. Also, if you've ever been to an art gallery or found something online and you read a statement and you just think, I have no idea what they're talking about, it sounds like pretentious BS to me. It's like, I've been there, I've read plenty of those, and I would say, okay, don't write those statements. Don't make that, because we don't want that either. If you don't want to read it, we don't want to, you sure as heck don't want to write it, I can tell you that. And so, like, think about in terms of being generous to the viewer. It's like, what would you want the viewer to know about your work that would help them to experience it in a fuller way? Maybe it's helpful for them to know that all of the photos that you took came from a particular place and what that place means to you. Or it could help them to know that you are attached to a set of ideas related to a kind of printmaking, and then how that kind of informs the work. But it should be readable. If you mention yourself, do it in the first person, just like use the word I do this, I do that. We have something in here, no more than one page. I've already mentioned length before, but not more than a page. I would encourage most of you, given the complexity of this, to keep it shorter. On the other hand, there may be situations where you're telling a story. Maybe it's helpful for you to tell a story about someone who has impacted the work or related to the work, in which case the statement can be a little bit longer. That's fine. Absolutely not more than a page, so that's really, you're testing people's patience with that. Not in a bad way, but it's just, you want to keep, again, the focus on the work. Use the present tense in the work. And we say unless the work was destroyed in a fire, it still exists, it's still out there doing what it does. These statements will actually be in the gallery, for the exhibit, so people can take a look at it, people can read it. And as we've said before, be kind of specific. You don't want to necessarily be talking, if your work is printmaking, don't be talking about the history of printmaking. You want to talk about like woodblock print. Maybe it's not even just woodblock print, but maybe it's a woodblock print from a certain era. And it might even be more specific than that. Maybe it's a woodblock print from a specific era with 2 or 3 different artists. So like, focus it down. We're way more interested in details and generalities. Generalities, which again is what ChatGPT does like really, really well, sort of vague and general. It's like that stuff does not make for compelling reading. You're not informing anybody in really great ways. And so you want to like tighten it up, make it specific and be clear. I found it really helpful to work on it a little bit along. If you think that, that using AI in this is going to help you crank it out faster so you can leave it for the night before, it sounds to me like that would be a really great way to create a statement that nobody wants to read, and certainly is not informing your work. So I would like, write on it a little bit at a time, let it sit, come back to it, make a draft, leave it for a week or two, you don't have a week, but a day or two. And then also, make other people read it, and also find somebody that's maybe not from an art background and make them read it. It's like, do you understand this? Because that's really your audience. The problem with museum work is they think sometimes those statements, they're being written for specific critics, specific, clientele or viewers that have a certain kind of knowledge base. That's not necessarily your knowledge base in this context. I would argue, actually in most contexts, the great majority of most contexts, that's not the goal of those artist statements. I think those, really high context statements are not super helpful for anybody. So make other people read it. Can they make sense out of it? Make them read it and then ask them, what do you think this art is about? Try an artist, try a non-artist. And that's going to be really helpful to, sort of get this thing. And so, in terms of, making this thing specific, we want to sort of hear what you have to say, create a context for the work. You're not trying to explain it, but you're just trying to offer ways for people who don't have any context for what you're doing. Like they've never seen this work before. They're coming up on a cold. It's like, what are some things that you can give them in terms of the writing that will help them to understand what you are doing? And that's the goal of this thing. And most of the time, these statements, like the really good ones, super common for, people to revise these 2, 3, 4 times. And most of the revising, is not sort of drastic. Sometimes between version 1 and 2, there's a lot of rewriting, but most of the time it's just like tweaking and sort of shaping and getting that language correct. So like I said, it can be a little tricky, but it's a helpful gift. I look at it as a kind of an act of generosity to the viewer. It's like, what can you give them that would allow them to sort of experience the work more fully? So, okay, I'm going to stop there. Thanks. We'll see you. Good luck with that.